Civil War was always going to be a contentious film. I mean, it's quite literally a movie about America's political divisions exploding into full-blown armed conflict, releasing at a time when America is perhaps more divided than it's been since the actual Civil War, during an election year no less. And not just any election, the first presidential election since the one that ended in an attempted coup. Yeah, the film's mere existence was bound to touch a nerve with audiences, particularly American audiences. But putting all of that aside, it just felt like people were rooting for this movie to fail. If, like me, you were unfortunate enough to stumble into the discourse surrounding Civil War in the months leading up to its release, you know exactly what I mean. Based on little more than a trailer, a few promotional images, and some choice quotes from writer-director Alex Garland, large swathes of the internet quickly decided this movie was going to be an embarrassing joke, a completely feckless, mealy-mouthed waste of time. An interesting premise squandered by a filmmaker unwilling to say anything of substance for fear of offending anyone. This derision based almost entirely on what people would glean from the trailers, which depicted the titular Civil War as a conflict between the Western forces, a military alliance between California and Texas, and the rest of the country, led by a tyrannical president who has exceeded his two-term limit in office. To many, this premise alone was enough to write the film off, because it seemed to indicate that Alex Garland, an Englishman, simply did not understand the political reality of modern America. I mean, the largest liberal and conservative states seceding to join forces? What a laughable misunderstanding of interstate politics. It felt like a cop-out designed to sidestep wading into the ugly, often uncomfortable minutia of America's deep-seated fissures. A refusal to say anything at all in order to avoid saying something controversial. Hell, I was even guilty of this to an extent too. While I think Alex Garland is a talented writer, he's clearly proven himself, I've always been a bit mixed on his work as a director. Ex Machina is undoubtedly a masterpiece, but 2022's Men left a really bad taste in my mouth. I mean, yeesh. And while I realize I'm very much in the minority on this, Annihilation's relentlessly bleak tone has just never worked for me. Although the bear scene is still one of the most horrific scenes I think I've ever seen in a movie, period. And then I also really like to show Devs on FX, which I know not a lot of people have watched, but I feel like ranks among some of the best work he's ever done. So Garland is a bit hit or miss for me, and because his most recent effort I just didn't really like at all, I was more than willing to buy into the narrative that was forming around this film. But the thing about internet narratives is that they're almost always complete bullshit. Snap judgments based on little to no information and spread so far so quickly that they become truisms before a counter narrative even has the chance to be articulated. And that has certainly been the case with Civil War. Contrary to what the online consensus had decided Alex Garland was trying and failing to do with this film, Civil War isn't actually trying to depict the most realistic way a second Civil War might play out. Hell, it's not even really about the specific issues that have polarized the United States over the past 60 years. Rather, it's a thought-provoking meditation on the broader mechanics of division, on the way the often arbitrary distinctions we make between ourselves and others allow us to abstract their humanity to such an extreme degree that violence becomes not only inevitable, but easy. And far from sitting on the fence, Garland lays this culture of dehumanization at the feet of the news media, whose dogged pursuit of objectivity, while admirable, is framed as being instrumental in facilitating this process of abstraction. Rather than the toothless mess of banal political equivocation that people suggested it would be based on little more than a trailer and some promotional material, Civil War is as incisive and biting as any political thriller released this century and deserves to be talked about in the same breath as the other great films about journalism, alongside the likes of Spotlight, Nightcrawler, Under Fire, and All the President's Men. And hey, it might be a miserable life having to go around emotionally detaching from your dear friends and the lives around you to take photos of the tragedy of war. But something that's the exact opposite is today's sponsor, Conflict of Nations. Conflict of Nations is a free online PvP strategy game where you pick a nation to lead in a fictional World War III. In these battles, you can fight up to 128 other players to see who will conquer the world. These battles aren't something like your standard first-person shooter that can be over in just a few minutes. These wars can take weeks to complete, giving you an excellent opportunity to build out your army with tanks, jets, nuclear submarines, and so much more. And the best part is, you can play this game wherever. Your account on your PC can be linked to your mobile device and vice versa. Plus, they just added a a Civil War theme to the game, so if it brings you some form of catharsis to create your own version of the excellent Alex Garland movie, see what states you can get to join your allegiance and sign up today. To get an exclusive gift, click on the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of a premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for the next 30 days, so don't wait. And I'll see you in the game. Thank you so much to Conflict of Nations for sponsoring this video. It's funny, for as wrong as the internet's initial impression of the film wound up being, the idea that Civil War is largely disinterested in exploring the specific circumstances that could lead to a second American Civil War is largely accurate. Where the initial backlash to the film's marketing got it wrong was in assuming this was an oversight on Alex Garland's part, an error born of simply misunderstanding the American political landscape. The same can be said of the film's politics. It would be a mistake to characterize Civil War as an apolitical film. It's simply not interested in partisan politics and the individual issues that define those divisions. Yes, in reality, Texas and California probably wouldn't form an alliance to oppose a tyrannical president. Despite being the two largest economies in the United States, the prevailing view of government in each state is just too divergent to make for a compatible alliance. And truthfully, given America's strict two-party system, it's extremely likely that one of these state governments would likely be in political alignment with the president. Likewise, in the event a second civil war breaks out in America, deep cultural and political differences beyond the mere ascendancy of a tyrannical president would likely be the cause of said fracture. I mean, the division between rural and metropolitan areas is far more salient in American politics than clear-cut state or regional divides, as are the politics of race and identity. These would likely be the lines along which the conflict was fought, not simple state boundaries. So the pedants weren't technically wrong to point these kind of things out, but they weren't technically right either. Having now seen the film, these critiques kind of remind me of the way Neil deGrasse Tyson engages with movies, which is to say that they treat the movie as an excuse to show off how smart you are rather than engaging with what the film is actually about. Because the reality is, as true as these little observations are, they kind of miss the overall point. Alex Garland isn't overlooking these partisan divides, he just isn't making a film about them. Instead, he's far more interested in the broader philosophical idea that underpins them, specifically the concept of abstraction. Civil War is a story about the consequences of abstracting the world around us to such a degree that we become unable to engage with it on a human level. Garland exemplifies this detachment by centering the story on a group of war journalists. Why journalists? Well, an appeal to objectivity is a core tenet of journalism. It's basically the principle the entire profession is built around, and that principle is almost always framed as a virtue. Good journalists don't get involved, don't get attached, and report nothing but the cold, hard facts. They stand outside the situations they chronicle and observe dispassionately. But Alex Garland isn't convinced this is a virtue so much as it is a delusion, and a dangerous one at that. What Civil War asks is, what do we lose when we view the world in this abstracted way, in which we separate ourselves as individuals from the events happening around us? Garland explores this idea most explicitly through the parallel journeys of the film's two lead characters, Lee Smith and Jesse Cullen. Lee, a veteran war journalist who has made a name for herself photographing the most horrific combat zones around the world, embodies the idealized version of a war journalist. She's fearless, tenacious, and most importantly, impartial. She quite literally views the world from behind a lens, a physical barrier that filters her perception and separates her from what is taking place directly in front of her. When the film starts, she's contrasted against Jesse, a rookie photojournalist who's ambitious but somewhat naive. In the first half of the film, we see Lee resist Jesse's presence under the guise of concern for her safety. They're in an incredibly volatile situation, and not only does Jesse's presence on the expedition to DC put her in danger, it essentially makes Lee her de facto guardian, a duty of care that actively clashes with Lee's impulse to remain detached and objective while in the field. We see how ill-equipped Lee is for this responsibility when the group stops for gas in rural Pennsylvania and comes across local militia who have captured and tortured some of their fellow townspeople. Confronted with this shocking cruelty, Jesse freezes up, forcing Lee to intervene and create some distance between them and the violence, asking the militant to pose in front of his victims so that she can photograph them. In the car following the incident, Lee scolds Jesse for not being capable of doing the job, something Jesse takes to heart. But we, as the audience, are left with a slightly different interpretation. Watching the scene, it was so obvious that Lee's dispassion in the moment was actually a coping mechanism. Rather than engaging with the barbarism she's witnessing, she takes refuge in her supposed objectivity, hiding behind the camera to avoid confronting the same horror that crippled Jesse. But the ultimate irony of the scene is that Lee's supposed objectivity doesn't actually put her above the situation the way she thinks it does. It makes her a part of it. While Jesse sees the violence for what it is, sadistic and senseless, Lee kind of ends up on the same level as the militant, a man who has abstracted the humanity of the people around him to such a degree that he's able to nonchalantly torture someone he admits to having grown up with. Both Lee and the militant think detaching themselves from their humanity gives them clarity, but it only binds them to how much a part of the problem they truly are. This moment forms the thesis of the entire film, one that is reiterated time and time again as the journalists make their way down to DC. How do civil wars happen when we stop seeing people we would otherwise relate to as human beings? Over the course of the film, Lee and Jesse essentially switch positions with one another. The further into the bowels of hell they descend, the more Lee's armor chips away. The conflict becomes gradually more personal for Lee, not only because of her guardianship of Jesse, but also because by its very nature, a civil war is a personal conflict. Lee has spent her life documenting wars overseas in situations that are slightly easier to abstract. The violence isn't happening in her backyard, so she can remain somewhat detached from it. It's still emotionally taxing, something we get a glimpse of when she relives these encounters and her nightmares towards the start of the film, but they aren't personal. But this civil war is different. This is happening to her as opposed to around her, and as a result, she begins to crack. By the time they've made it to DC, Lee is fully panicking, unable to remove herself in the violence she's witnessing. In contrast, Jesse's story follows the exact opposite trajectory. Over the course of the movie, we watch her disassociate from the violence she's surrounded by, learning to remove herself from the situation and view things through her lens instead. And perhaps the most powerful scene in the movie, probably the scene of the year if you ask me, Jesse is taken hostage by a deranged militant played brilliantly by Jesse Plemons. Holy shit, guys. This fucking scene, wow. Plemons is the ultimate distillation of the abstraction the characters have been wrestling with the entire time. He is completely devoid of humanity, and that emptiness makes him incredibly threatening. His allegiance is hard to define beyond the fact he is an ultranationalist, capitalizing on the chaos of the fighting to target people he views as insufficiently American. It's a genuinely chilling scene because the character is almost impossible to read, seemingly acting on impulse from moment to moment. And the brilliant thing about the way Alex Garland structures this scene is we all go into it knowing something is going to happen, knowing the gun is going to go off and someone is going to die. But even with that in mind, while we're watching the characters try to negotiate their way out of it, watching Jesse Plemons just completely dehumanize himself in this moment, when the gun actually goes off, it's a shock, because it happens right before when we're conditioned to think it's going to happen. This confrontation is Lee's breaking point. Despite being unable to verify the nature of the situation, Lee and her counterparts charge in. On one hand, because their hubris as journalists means they think they can figure the situation out as they go, and on the other, because their ability to remain objective observers is compromised. After all, the hostages are their friends, so when Plemons' character is not only someone they can't figure out, but completely unsympathetic to their humanity, it causes Lee to spiral. In the aftermath, Lee deletes the photo of her slain compatriot, despite earlier in the film suggesting that she'd have no qualms photographing a fellow journalist's death if it meant capturing the story. For the first time in her life, it hits too close to home, and she has to surrender to her humanity. But despite being an even more harrowing encounter for Jesse, it winds up having the opposite effect on her. It's galvanizing, something made evident by her behavior during the siege on DC. While Lee grapples with the horror she's witnessing, Jesse is fully desensitized, taking risky shots and documenting the violence without hesitation. She is fully detached from the brutality she's witnessing. But if this switch was all these parallel characters' acts amounted to, the film would almost read as a commentary on the harrowing toll of war journalism, an ode to the sacrifices they make rather than a critique of their underlying philosophy. But that's not what Civil War is. This is a critique, a point made hammered home in the climax of the film when Lee tackles Jesse to the ground to protect her from incoming fire, only for Jesse to photograph Lee's final moments as she crumples lifelessly to the floor. This moment solidifies Jesse's transformation from the rookie to the veteran. In this moment, Jesse has essentially surrendered her humanity, refusing to engage with the death of her mentor, her friend, on a personal level, a death she is partially responsible for. It just becomes another story. It's not hard to see how this critique of news media extends well beyond the realm of war journalism. Anyone who's read a news article about an issue they care about can tell you that an appeal to objectivity can sometimes blind journalists to the underlying truth of a matter. Sure, you can report on a war or a genocide or climate change with an air of objectivity, refusing to engage with the material on an emotional level and simply relaying the information as you see it in passive, neutral language. But is that not stripping the story of its inherent horror? When a reporter refuses to call something horrible out of fear it might suggest bias, are they not just contributing to the normalization of that horrible thing? In Alex Garland's eyes, the answer is yes. Yes, they are. With Civil War, Garland suggests that when we stop allowing ourselves to connect with our human reaction to bad things, we are essentially facilitating those bad things. If silence is complicity, then an appeal to objectivity in the face of immorality is tantamount to an endorsement, which makes the film's approach to the politics of its conflict all the more brilliant in my eyes. In a sense, he's doing the very thing he's criticizing in order to give the audience permission to engage with the conflict on a human level, abstracting the concept of a second American Civil War just enough that we don't get caught up in our own personal biases and can instead just view the violence and dehumanization on a purely visceral level. When we watch Jesse Plemons berate the group, we aren't thinking about his stance on X, Y, or Z issues and whether we disagree or agree with his cause in spite of his methods, because we haven't been told about what those stances are. As a result of that absence of context, we're forced to confront his inhumanity, raw, without any confounding information that might rationalize his position and subsequently dull our horror. Likewise, by taking the largest conservative state and the largest liberal state in the country and making them the insurgency, Garland further prevents us from mapping our partisan political biases to the film's conflict. We can't see the Western forces as the good guys or the United States as the bad guys beyond the simple framework of a rebellion against tyranny. And as a result, we're invited to engage with the actions of each party. In the few instances we get allusions to specific events, like the so-called Antifa massacre, the film is careful not to indicate what that means, who was massacred and who did the massacring. You can make assumptions, but it's deliberately vague. In avoiding specificity in this way, the film essentially universalizes the conflict so that its message is readable to either side of the political spectrum, but not in a way that neuters its overarching political point. This is very much an anti-fascist, anti-totalitarian film. It's a film that values journalism while critiquing the way in which journalism is often done, and detests the politics of dehumanization that we see proliferating in nearly every corner of partisan politics today. But it doesn't want a debate about specific ideas to distract from its far more fundamental point about humanity itself. It's for this reason that when the film first started, I was a little conflicted about the very way Garland uses Nick Offerman's unnamed president. Although he's not really in the film very much, and Nick Offerman does a great job, he felt decidedly Trumpian. Not in an overt, cartoonish way, but in some of his mannerisms. The film opens with the president rehearsing a speech to the nation, playing with tone and inflection in a deeply insincere way that felt reminiscent of the infamous leaked clips of Donald Trump rehearsing and revising his statement to the nation in the wake of the January 6th assault on the US Capitol. Even the language choices in the president's speech feel a little Trumpy, with the president referencing unnamed people, declaring a US victory as one of the greatest victories in the history of military campaigns, a line that feels ripped right out of the former president's mouth. This level of specificity almost felt at odds with what the rest of the film is going for. In a movie that intentionally blurs the details of its conflict, this almost felt too direct a parallel to real-world politics. But by the end of the film, I kind of realized that I had inadvertently done exactly what Alex Garland had expected me to do. I'd filled in the spaces he intentionally left with my own biases, to the point where I just assumed this presidential character was meant to be a Trump stand-in. While I stand by the idea these were deliberate allusions to a historic moment in American history, to suggest that makes the character a Trump stand-in is more on me than it is the filmmakers, a reflection of how I chose to interpret what was put in front of me. But in making that assumption, I was forced to confront the way I also abstracted my political enemies. The final act of the film is the siege of DC, and throughout this entire sequence, I found myself starting to buy into the Western forces narrative, because I had conflated the president with a real-life politician I'm not particularly fond of. I found myself rooting for the Western forces to take him down. He was no longer just the general personification of a tyrant, he was my ideological enemy. But as the Western forces stormed the White House office, I started to get an uneasy feeling, one that worsened when the soldiers shot the press secretary and breached the Oval Office to find the president cowering under his desk. I had abstracted the bookend actions of the Western forces because I'd subconsciously begun seeing them as my team in the fight. So when they finally executed the president, I felt a deep sense of culpability. Not because the president was actually innocent or undeserving of punishment for his crimes, but because I had allowed myself to stop seeing him as a human. This honestly shook me to my core. Like, genuinely, I was just left in my seat, speechless, stunned, and just really in my thoughts a bit as the credits rolled over a developing photograph of the Western Forces strike team standing over the president's corpse like a hunting trophy. I felt a little ashamed of myself, to be honest. And that visceral reaction is entirely the point of the film. It's also why Garland deliberately uses the visual language of war films about foreign war to frame this domestic conflict. By employing the cinematic language of Vietnam and especially the Iraq war films, he challenges the notion of American exceptionalism that underpins most discussions of a second US Civil War. When Americans talk about a second Civil War, most of us don't take the idea too seriously, in large part because we believe it can't and won't happen here again. Sure, things are tense politically, but the idea of it actually escalating into an armed conflict is treated like a dark joke. After all, that's something that happens elsewhere. But just as he wants to break through our biases and force us to confront the naked ugliness of the way we dehumanize each other in political conflicts, Garland also wants to dispel the notion that we're somehow above the threat of civil war. This can happen here, and in a lot of ways it already is. We aren't immune, and in fact thinking you're immune is the easiest way to fall right into the kind of dehumanizing worldview that facilitates such a conflict. In a meta sense, Civil War almost feels like a rebuke of the way Alex Garland has been characterized as a filmmaker: cold, cynical, and aloof. This is something I myself have accused him of for years, but this film feels like Garland directly addressing that popular conception of him. In that way, it weirdly kind of reminds me of Interstellar. Like with that film, a lot of people went in expecting a cold, cerebral experience, an exercise in high-minded intellectualism, and were instead given a deeply sentimental, emotionally driven movie. Based on the way people online reacted to the marketing material, it certainly felt like they were expecting Civil War to be a more granular deconstruction of contemporary American politics, which is in large part why it was mocked right out of the gate for seemingly missing the mark in that regard. But instead, Civil War feels like Alex Garland affirming himself as a deeply humanistic filmmaker, one more concerned with people than the dry mechanics of political and sociological theory.
Every time I survived a war zone, I thought I was sending a warning home. Don't do this. But here we are.
The more I think about Civil War, the more this line feels like its mission statement. Like Lee, Garland sees this film as a warning. Don't do this. It's why the film is so critical of journalists, despite clearly respecting them a great deal. And it's why he chooses to avoid getting into the specifics of the conflict, opting to speak to the underlying societal rot that facilitates the normalization of political violence. These are messages that feel designed to resonate across the political spectrum. So, in a way, people were right to say Alex Garland didn't want to offend anyone with this film, but it would be a big mistake to characterize this aversion to quote-unquote picking a side as an act of cowardice or ignorance. Likewise, it's also not some holier-than-thou both sides are equally to blame finger-wagging by an enlightened centrist. No, it's an act of utility. Garland isn't interested in grandstanding or lecturing his ideological enemies or affirming ideological peers, because he recognizes the stakes are far too high to risk alienating the people who need to hear his distress call most. Garland is warning us, all of us, of what awaits if we continue down this path as a nation. But whether we heed that warning is entirely up to us.
If the left wants to combat right-wing extremism, it needs to be in the business of winning elections. That's its job. That is the function of the left in a situation like this, is hands down, flat out, to win an election. And you do not win an election without usually persuading people of the other side to come and join you. And you don't do that by screaming at them and telling them they're on it.
Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out this video. It's been a lot of fun to put together, but I'll mostly be curious to see what you all thought about Civil War. I know it's a film that is controversial. A lot of people have a bunch of different opinions about it, so be sure to leave those down in the comment section below. Thank you so much to our channel members for supporting the channel on that level. If you're interested in that, you can check that out in the description. And most importantly, thank you so much to Conflict of Nations for sponsoring this video. Be sure to click the link down in the description below to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free for the next 30 days. So don't wait, jump on this. And yeah, thank you all for being amazing, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.